Meet Steve Lopez.
My name's Steve Lopez, and I'm a pro-life volunteer with Spiritist Films, and so I've been standing outside of Planned Parenthoods and other abortion clinics for over 4 years now.
Why are you involved in the pro-life movement?
I think my answer is probably similar to a lot of Americans. I was actually not involved in the pro-life movement for a long time, and I was a kind of a self-worshiping, self-serving business guy trying to make money, and that leads to a place, just like everything else in life, where God isn't sort of in the center and you're in the center. It leads to unhappiness and often self-destruction. And so me and my business partners, after a long time working together for many years in Los Angeles, working in the film industry, we started to self-reflect. We also were doing computer games and other stuff that, we had kind of a high opinion of ourselves. Like we said, if we were around during slavery, we would have definitely fought to end slavery. We'd have definitely fought the Nazis and, helped to free the Jews, the Gypsies, and the Russians. But then we looked at our lives and we said, what are we actually doing right now other than trying to achieve a selfish goal? And so we said, well, what can we do to, actually become the idea that we have for ourselves? And so one of the easy ones in our mind was like a black and white issue would be abortion. And so we just drove to an abortion clinic, and it was closed on a Sunday, and we stood in front of it. And it just so happened that 40 Days for Life was going on at the same time. And so we thought, well, awesome, the hard work is done. These people are already all over the United States standing for 40 days in front of these abortion clinics. And so we thought, well, we'll just go interview these people, and the Mother Teresas and the Gandhis, and just capture their stories. And we met a lot of awesome people, but unfortunately, and this is true in a lot of different cities, sometimes there's nobody there. You show up with the cameras and the mics, and you're alone, and the women are coming in and the fathers are coming in for abortions, and they're walking past you, and you start to talk to them, and they have questions, and they have a lot of rhetoric that they've heard from television or from their school teachers or their college professors. And so that's where we actually had to confront a lot of the lies that Planned Parenthood and other abortion clinics put out there, their propaganda. And that's, it was kind of just through trial and error and conversations that we realized that, wow, the abortionists do not have the intellectual high ground. All of their arguments are empty when you actually sit down and think about it and do some research, in that the intellectual high ground is actually on the pro-life side.
This is not a baby, right? When does life begin?
Yeah, you do hear that a lot, and that's one of their stronger arguments initially. When you just sort of first hear it for the first time, you're like, well, how do we know that? And so what I like to try to do is to create another analogy to see if, because we're really just wagering on things. Like, well, I believe that life begins at conception. All your DNA, all your chromosomes are right there, and it's just you're going to evolve. And I'll say that as I get older, as an adult, I'm still evolving. I'm still getting new neurons in my brain. And they'll say, well, no, you have to reach a point of consciousness and this, that, and the other. So I'll say, okay, so it's all about, we're wagering, and that's what they want to discuss. So I say, let's imagine 500 school buses with the windows blacked out, and we don't know what's inside. And there's TNT attached to all these buses, and here's the plunger. Would you push that plunger for $5,000 if there was only a 1% chance that those school buses were filled with innocent children? And I've never met a person say, sure, I would do it. They'd be like, that would be awful. So I said, let's bring that principle back to abortion. You're saying that you want to wager some kind of odds on whether that baby's a human. If I gave you, the same odds, you're going to give me a different answer. So it's not really a principle, right? You come up with that argument. We looked at it in another situation. We realized that actually when there's like even a 1% chance that you could hurt somebody, you don't want to do it. But when it comes to a selfish goal, you don't want to raise a kid, then you want to just forget about that principle. Say, well, no, because we know that baby is going to actually grow up to be a full human being. And that's related to Pascal's wager, where Pascal was thinking about God, and he said, well, if there's no God, then if you're an atheist and there's no God, nothing happens. But if there is a God, good things happen. So therefore, you should be a God. You should believe in God. But there, it's still speculation, right? We don't know. No one's had or some people. I have never had a personal voice say, "Hey, Steve, I'm here," and faith in God or belief in God requires faith. With the baby, there's no question that if we do not interfere, it's going to grow up to be a full human being. And so that's even better than Pascal's wager.
Isn't it just a mass of cells?
They'll say, this is just, it's like a parasite. And so when I first heard that, standing outside of an abortion clinic, I thought, well, it must be a mass of cells. And that's what it's still run. But I was like, how do you know it's a mass of cells? Well, somebody told me. So I'm like, okay, I'll go look that up. And it turns out, if you look at the 1.2 million surgical abortions that occur every year, the vast majority, if not almost all of them, occur to babies with beating hearts and developing brains. So when we start talking about that, people start to get less comfortable with abortion. But that's what abortion is. And the reason we know that is because in order for a person to get an abortion, they have to first realize that they're pregnant. So they have to have a pregnancy test. And that takes up to 3 weeks or 4 weeks to become accurate. And then they still have to schedule the abortion. It's not like McDonald's where you have like a drive-through abortion. So all of that requires time. So by the time they get in there for the abortion, they're typically at least 4 weeks. And how Planned Parenthood tries to hide that number is they'll just say, well, like less than 9 weeks, less than 8 weeks. But at 4 weeks, the heart is beating and the brain is developing. So that's what we're talking about. And I remember talking to one of the volunteers at Planned Parenthood, and he was a vegetarian, and he was very proud of that fact. And so I asked him, I was like, well, why are you a vegetarian? He said, well, I went to one of these meat processing facilities, and I saw what they do, to the cows. And I said to myself, if I can't do that personally, then I should not eat meat. And I said, so okay, so you understand abortion, so you've seen a little fetus and had it in your hands with its heart beating, and you could crush it. And he's like, wow, I never thought of it that way. I never thought about what it actually is, because he was thinking of it as an undifferentiated mass of cells. So if it's a little, you could see its little arms and its little legs and its heart beating, and you couldn't crush it. I think few Americans could. Then maybe you shouldn't be out here defending it. And then he's like, I'll have to think about that. And I never saw him again after that.
What do you know about Planned Parenthood? It's all about women's health, right?
Planned Parenthood has a lot of money. They get $300 million a year in federal funds from the United States government, and they have almost $1 billion in the bank. Most people don't realize that. If you go look at their annual report, they have almost $1 billion sitting in the bank. They don't need federal taxpayer dollars, but the only way for them to get them is to act as if there's some kind of healthcare organization. All of the services that Planned Parenthood provides outside of abortion can be had someplace else. STD testing, and things like that. That can be done elsewhere. We don't need to have Planned Parenthood. I mean, that's the rhetoric, like without us, the sky would fall. No, without you, all of the services that you provide are being provided elsewhere where babies are not being dismembered.
Does Planned Parenthood profit from abortions?
Most of what I know about Planned Parenthood comes from my discussions with people who used to work there. So we interviewed Abby Johnson, who was the National Employee of the Year in, I think, 2008. We also interviewed Ramona Trevino. And so when you listen to them talk about, because they've actually seen the books, they talk about abortion being what keeps them in the black. So if it's abortion that keeps them in business, if abortion were banned and they could no longer do abortions, Planned Parenthood as we know it would cease to exist. They talk about all of their sort of ancillary services and don't want to talk about abortion. They'll say, well, it's 3% of our services, but they do approximately 330,000 abortions every year. But they don't want us to think about that. They want to talk about, it'd be like going to McDonald's. I mean, imagine if any other business was that way. Imagine if you went to McDonald's and 330,000 children died at McDonald's every year, but they're like, hey, wait a minute. We delivered 7 million Happy Meals separate from that. Well, that's not, if even one child dies because of force, that's a terrible thing. So, Planned Parenthood, they make a lot of money off of abortion. It's what keeps them in the black. And they talk about abortion being a side issue, but if you listen to the people that work there, they promote abortion. They set basically quotas. If you're not doing enough abortions, they'll tell their directors, you need to increase those numbers.
Is abortion a healthcare service?
Well, first of all, abortion isn't healthcare, right? Dismemberment of a baby is not healthcare. In fact, the physicians that are involved with abortion are in violation of the Hippocratic Oath. The actual Hippocratic Oath, if you go look it up, if you go check Wikipedia or go Google it and read the original Hippocratic Oath, it tells doctors to do no harm, and it specifically tells them not to perform abortions. What happened during the sexual revolution, they went in, they obviously modified the wording to change that, but the actual Hippocratic Oath in its original form encourages doctors not to do that. So I wish that the doctors that work at Planned Parenthood, if they would just honor the actual Hippocratic Oath, we would no longer have abortions.
What are some statistics on abortion at Planned Parenthood?
Yeah, despite the rhetoric of Planned Parenthood, where they talk about it being safe and rare, if you look at their statistics from the Guttmacher Institute, which they formed, so these are their numbers, half the women that come in to get an abortion were using no birth control at all. So that means that their form of birth control, their primary form of birth control, is abortion. And the other half were using birth control. So Planned Parenthood talks about safe sex. How is it that 600,000 babies are aborted every year when the people were practicing safe sex? So there is no such thing as safe sex. There's only sex with consequences. And 50% of the people that come in to an abortion clinic approximately are repeat customers. So that means that they came there, they went through the education process, whatever that is, at these abortion clinics, and they came back and made the same mistake twice. So we look at all those numbers, you realize that, wow, 25% didn't use birth control, came in and got an abortion. So you'd think they would have learned their lesson. They went through this wonderful education at these abortion clinics. And they went back out, had sex again with no birth control, and came back again for an abortion. So that talks about the irresponsibility that's resulted from abortion and how people misuse it. I mean, I think a lot of people, even who are pro-choice, when they hear these numbers, are uncomfortable with it. So, I mean, abortion today is basically a primary means of birth control for a lot of people.
How do abortions fit into the business infrastructure of Planned Parenthood?
They have a financial incentive to make sure, just like any other business, right? If this person keeps coming back, I make $400 to $1,600, depending on where they are in the gestation, every time they come back. So they have a financial incentive to make sure that the people come back. And if you look at, like I just did an interview on Charlottesville's numbers, bucking the trend of the entire state, Planned Parenthood's numbers, where it was up 25%, despite the fact that it was down all across Virginia. And that's because abortion is a money-making business, and that's like a huge profit center for Planned Parenthood and all abortion clinics. So they have every financial reason to make sure that their customers come back again and again and again.
What are the adoption choices at Planned Parenthood?
That's the interesting thing, because if Planned Parenthood wanted to, they could become the #1 adoption agency by far in the United States. They do not provide any adoption services. So we know, based upon their actions, despite they have their rhetoric over here that, oh, we want to give you options. Well, do you have an adoption option at Planned Parenthood? The answer is no. They'll say, well, we can refer that out. And if you listen to the people who work there, if you refer out, you just lost $400, right? You listen to Abby Johnson's interview, and she has some stories where she talked about where she actually wanted to, she was happy that like a mother found out she had twins, they're going to keep it, and then she was scolded by her boss that, hey, come on, that's money out the door. So I really don't think, based upon the people that I've talked to who work in the clinics, that they are actually promoting the alternatives.
Why are you only concerned with the unborn children? Why don't you care about the unwanted and abused children of the world?
Well, I agree with the initial statement that we should, of course, be concerned about the people that are already here. And I think a lot of times when they make statements like that, the assumption is that these babies are going to have a similar type of life, right? So, and that assumes that they can forecast the future. And we can barely forecast tomorrow's weather. We cannot take the position of being an all-knowing God and say, well, we need to abort these babies because we know that their futures are going to be horrific. And it also assumes that anybody who's been abused or had a rough life is better off dead. Most of the people who I've talked to who've experienced a rough life would prefer to live. And so I think it's the kind of the height of tyranny to think like, well, we're going to prescribe in advance what we think a person's life's going to be and determine for them whether they should live or die. And I think that's just wrong on its face.
Abortion is a solution to an overpopulated world.
You hear that quite often, that in fact almost every time I'm in front of the clinic that I'll hear that from somebody, that that this is just going to contribute to the overpopulation problem. And I'll say, so is there an overpopulation problem in the United States? What's the carrying capacity of the United States? And they'll look at me like, well, what do you mean? They make that statement as if it's a foregone conclusion that there's an actual overpopulation problem. If you look at countries like India and China, they have over 1 billion people in each country with nowhere near the infrastructure that the United States has. We have about 300 million people in the United States. The carrying capacity of the United States is at least as large as India and China, if not 2 or 3 times that. So we actually do not have a population problem in the United States. We do have a selfishness problem, because what ends up happening is people think like, well, I don't want to share any of my stuff with any more people. This is my stuff. But what they don't realize is that the only reason why they're alive is because people were born making technology that allowed for them to eat. I mean, we have agriculture today. If there's only 50 of us standing around, we'd have no highways. We'd have no internet. People have value. People solve problems. And so I think, we've wiped out 50 million Americans who would have contributed to our society, and they would have made America better. They would have helped pay for Social Security in the future. They would have made this place, America, even greater than it already is. So the idea that these children are worthless and they would not help America is, I think, also just false. It's not true.
If abortion is illegal, we'll return to the days of dark alley or coat hanger abortions.
Initially, when I first heard that, I thought that was actually a true story. And it wasn't until I watched the interviews of Bernard Nathanson, who started NARAL, and he actually just made up that story to stoke the debate and of course journalists didn't check the facts on any of that, and even his abortion numbers were inflated, because what they want to do is create the woman as a victim and get our attention away from the baby and its rights. It is, because the baby is actually the victim, and so I've interviewed multiple women who had abortions before Roe versus Wade or before 1973. None of them went to a back alley. None of them used a coat hanger. They all went to physicians, and the physicians performed the abortions illegally. And I think it's true that if we ban abortion, there will probably still be abortions, just as we ban rape and pedophilia, but yet there's still rape and pedophilia. However, no one's arguing that. You want to know what? We should just legalize rape and pedophilia, because you know what? Rapists are still going to rape, and those pedophiles are still going to molest. That's true, but we punish them, right? And there's far fewer rapes today because of those rape laws than if there were no rape laws. And we know that when abortion is banned, the numbers are way lower, because people talk about what would happen if abortion was illegal as if it's some kind of fantasy. All we have to do is go back to the years before 1973 and look at those numbers, and they were like below 100,000. So we would have saved millions and millions and millions and millions of lives if abortion was never made legal through Roe versus Wade.
Abortion is a woman's issue, and men should have no say on it.
It's become a little bit of a gender war, especially from the feminist perspective. Keep your rosaries off my ovaries, or when you have when you grow an ovary, then I'll care about what your opinion is. And that's nobody applies that principle anywhere else in their life. Like, you don't go to your surgeon and say, hey, well, have you had cancer before? Because I'm not going to have you operate on me unless you've had cancer. No, we don't apply that. It's like you can have an opinion about something. Like, in other words, like Abraham Lincoln wasn't a slave, but he stood up against slavery, right? He didn't have to have a plantation to understand the horror of of slavery. I mean, the plantation owners could have said, hey, why don't you mind your own business? When you get a plantation, you understand my situation, then you can tell me what to do with slaves. And that's kind of the same logic that people try to apply, to abortion. And of course, they ignore all of the women who are out there, right? I mean, okay, so even if that principle was correct, right? You want to listen to a man. At least half or more of the people that are out there in front of Planned Parenthood are females. What do they say to them? Like, oh, well, we just disagree with you, which is the truth of it.
Abortion should be readily available to victims of rape and incest, or to save the life of the mother.
The rape, incest, or life of the mother are the ones you hear a lot of, even though they're a tiny fraction of the abortions. A lot of people are under the misguided notion that most of the abortions that are occurring in abortion clinics are a result of rape, incest, or life of the mother. Life of the mother, if the mother's life is in jeopardy, she's not going to an abortion clinic, she's going to a hospital. So those are off the table right away. With regard to rape and incest, the best answer I have ever heard is a history teacher, high school teacher in Houston, who was asked this question, and he said, well, let's think about rape. What do we do to the rapist when we catch him? If he's caught, because often they're not caught. We get 2 or 3 years in prison, if that. And he's the guilty party. Now let's think about the baby who's innocent. Why does the baby get the death penalty? I was like, that's an excellent point. Just as you think about it, it doesn't sound like justice. How is that justice? Because the baby didn't, if a baby has an unalienable right to life, it shouldn't matter the circumstances of its creation, right? It's horrible and awful that a rapist would do something like that. But we don't even treat the rapist that way. Nobody's like life in prison for you or death penalty for you. But somehow, with our twisted logic, we apply that to an innocent baby. And I think if you think of it in those terms, you can see the injustice of it.
The woman's right to privacy overrides the baby's right to life.
Yeah, so there's two things that you hear. One is the right to privacy, and the other is it's my body and my choice, or a property right claim. And you hear my body, my choice a lot. And so you start to think about that as like the government can't tell me what to do with my body. And you start to wonder, is that really a principle that we really live by? Or is that just rhetoric to justify our actions? And so the government has got a lot of laws. There's a lot of laws where the government's telling you what you can and can't do with your body. Chief among them is the drunk driving laws. The drunk driving laws tell you what you can and can't, regardless of whether you're male or female. They tell you that you cannot get into the car and drive drunk and kill somebody. And most of the people who are for abortion are also for the drunk driving laws. And I say, well, why is that? They're like, well, because you could kill someone. You could kill an innocent third party. I say, aha. Your brain can understand that there's other rights for other people. You're worried about the rights of a third party. And that's why abortion's wrong, because these babies also have rights. These babies have an unalienable right to life. So it's not just about the government willy-nilly telling you what to do. It's about having to weigh your rights versus someone else's. So just for the same logic that we have these drunk driving laws and traffic laws to protect other people is the same reason why abortion is wrong, because we're trying to protect the baby's unalienable right to life.
Today's generation doesn't know a world without legalized abortion. How do they discern pro-life versus pro-choice?
Well, I think one thing everybody needs to do is actually read the Roe versus Wade decision in the Griswold v. Connecticut decision, because it's shocking. Because most people think that there actually is a right to abortion. Some people will tell me that they haven't even read the Constitution, but they'll be like, there's a right in the Constitution to abortion. And I'll say, well, where? And they've never read it. They have no idea. They're just counting on what they heard from somebody else. And if you look at Roe versus Wade, there actually is no constitutional right to abortion. What they were saying is there's a right to privacy. And that didn't even come from that decision, because that was on the precedent of another Supreme Court case over contraception, which is called Griswold v. Connecticut. And so you say, well, where did the Supreme Court, the highest law in the land, come up with this right to privacy? And you go read the decision, and you're like, oh, they just made it up. They say, out of the emanations and the penumbras of the Constitution comes this right to privacy. So they just legislated from the bench, which makes the Griswold v. Connecticut decision bogus, and the Roe versus Wade decision bogus. There is no right to privacy, but there is an unalienable right to life as outlined in the Declaration of Independence for these babies. So from a legal perspective, from my analysis, the benefit is to the baby. And we've tried to, after the sexual revolution, we tried to come up with some kind of way to, once there was a lot of casual sex and there was a lot of unintended pregnancies, even with people practicing safe sex, what are we going to do about it? And so the Supreme Court stepped in and said, well, we're just going to start making up stuff so that people can have these abortions. And so what has to happen is ultimately, I hope, some state governments, some governors stand up and just say, look, this is not constitutional. And you can't, and even if Congress tried to amend the Constitution, you can't take away an unalienable right. Otherwise, it would be alienable.
Is Roe v. Wade a justified law?
And a lot of even liberal legal scholars have issues with Roe versus Wade. It's not good law. It's bad law. There is no good intellectual arguments to justify tyranny. And there's good corollaries between abortion and slavery, because slavery was legal. The Supreme Court in Dred Scott said slavery was just fine. Congress, when they overturned the Missouri Compromise with the Nebraska Act, they said slavery was just fine. All the laws of the South says, but we all know through common sense that slavery is just wrong on its face, right? So you had Abraham Lincoln in these debates. He had the Supreme Court against him, Congress against him, all the laws of the South against him, quoting the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so Abraham Lincoln said, look, if we don't believe in that, we should just tear up these statutes, because all the colonies had adopted the Declaration of Independence as law. In the same situation, it's the old doll in new clothes. Now we're saying these, just like we said the slaves weren't human and these unalienable rights didn't apply to them, we're using the same logic to justify the tyranny of abortion. We're saying, well, these babies don't have an unalienable right to life. And most people don't even get to that point. They just say, well, there must be some right for the woman to have an abortion in the Constitution. No, it's not there, but there is an unalienable right to life. And so the good news for pro-lifers is that we actually have the intellectual high ground, right? The law is actually on our side. They don't even have any laws. They have to just make them up to justify their tyranny. And it's going to take people to actually recognize that and become an abolitionist, just like Abraham Lincoln, because there used to be two political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats. And that ended when the abolitionists like Abraham Lincoln said, you want to know what? We're done compromising on slavery. And the Republican Party was born out of the question of slavery. And it's because those people stood up and started a new party. And I'm not saying that the Republican Party needs to be disbanded, but people within the Republican Party need to look at their roots, because the Republican Party was born out of patriotism and actually upholding our fundamental rights. And there's a lot of Republicans who aren't doing that today.
How does the current presidential administration affect the issue of abortion?
I think it's interesting because a lot of, I'm not Catholic, but I know a lot of Catholic bishops put their faith in Barack Obama to keep his word, right? And they were shocked when Barack Obama didn't keep his word. None of them could have done any research on Barack Obama, because Barack Obama could not be any more in the pocket of Planned Parenthood other than being the president of Planned Parenthood. He's made, in the last few months, 2 Planned Parenthood ads. One is a paid television ad promoting Planned Parenthood. He thinks that abortion is essential health care. He thinks he even defends partial birth abortion. He did it in Illinois. He did it again as a senator. So the fact that Barack Obama would want to go back on whatever word he gave them in the back, back rooms or whatever, doesn't surprise me, because he's keeping his word to his true constituency, which is the abortion industry, right? He made speeches while he was running for president, that abortion is essential health care and that he wants it to be part of insurance. And so all he's doing is keeping his verbal promises to Planned Parenthood. So I view it as anybody who thought that they could make a deal with Barack Obama on those issues had their fingers in their ears and was not listening to anything he said on abortion. And I think a lot of people, just like with abortion, they did not do any research on Barack Obama. You know, it's like Barack Obama said a lot of things that were shocking then, before he was ever president, and he's continued to say a lot of shocking things. Barack Obama has, as part of his campaign this year, paid television ads. It's a campaign against the unborn, right? Because his constituency is Planned Parenthood, and their enemy is the unborn. That's how they make their money. And so I'm not surprised that the administration would end up making decisions that would try to force their views, onto private organizations one bit.
Who is the face of the pro-life movement?
I know that probably a lot of people who are watching this might be surprised by some of the things that they've heard, and it's like, what's the next step that you can do? And one of the things that I think a lot of people are afraid of is that they have an idea about the pro-life movement, that it's a bunch of radicals who are out there to tell women how to live their lives, but that's actually not the truth. That the people that I've met who are standing in front of Planned Parenthood or other abortion clinics, a lot of them are post-abortive moms and post-abortive dads, and they're out there because they love those moms and dads, and they love those clinic workers, and that's actually inspired me. When I actually I have a friend named Martha who is post-abortive, and I remember her first day out there, a person called me up and said, you need to be prepared for this person named Martha. She's coming and she's really scared. And I was like, okay, I'll keep an eye out for her. I said, I've only met one person and she's been here for 3 hours and just been disarming everybody and this wonderful ambassador. And that was Martha. And I was like, wow. And I was like watching Martha and I was like, Martha, I've watched you talk to people who are coming to tell you off. And like in 15 seconds, they got their heads down, and there was this one gentleman who's like, at the end of the 30-minute conversation with Martha, he's like, I was coming down here to tell you off. I wasn't coming down here to feel convicted. And it's like, it's because Martha loved him, and you can't fake love. And I think like one of the things that we need to really work on, and I've had to work on this myself, is how do we love these people? I mean, how do we love the clinic workers? How do we love the moms and dads? How do we go out there and let them know that we're trying to be not just a friend, because a friend will just say, don't worry about it, get an abortion, you're going to be okay. But your brother or your sister, your spiritual brother or your sister, might tell you, you need to not go do that. That's going to be bad for you. That's real love, right? We need to actually show people real love.
In the face of anger and confusion, pro-life advocates turn to love.
And it's tough because standing in front of an abortion clinic isn't always enjoyable. Because sometimes you're going to love people, and they're not going to love you back initially. And when I was in Charlottesville, there was a young man who used to get out of his car, and he would yell at all of us, each and every one of us. And one day we had an hour of power where 80 people showed up, and he got out of his car and yelled at every single person. And he's blocked traffic. The police were called by the people who were stuck in traffic, and he left. And he was filled with anger. But as we were listening to him, a lot of people started praying for him. I said to him, like, someday you may be a great minister because your voice is so loud and they can hear you for blocks. And my last day in Charlottesville, I was at an abortion clinic and it was dark and a car pulled up and a guy jumped out and I was like, oh no, this is going to be another one of those experiences. But then I saw it was him. I was like, oh, he's just going to yell at us for 15 or 20 minutes and then he's going to leave. But he was crying. And so I thought, okay, this is not going like that. I was like, what's wrong? He said, well, I was talking to a friend of mine about abortion, and halfway through the conversation, and we got on the topic of abortion randomly. He's like, I wasn't even wanting to talk about it. And I was talking with her, and I just started to cry. And he said, why? I thought to myself, why am I crying? I don't like people who are pro-life. And he said, that's when I realized that it was a sin, and abortion was wrong. And that I was Saul, except instead of throwing stones, I was throwing words. And he said, so I'm coming out here to apologize. And I said, man, I wish those 80 people could see you now, because you filled so many of them with fear, and a lot of them are probably afraid to come back, but they didn't know that God was working on you. The person who's bothered by it and yelling the loudest, you know, God could be working on them. And his next question, he's like, well, how do I get involved? What can I do to, you know, help end this? And so that's another thing to remember. Yeah, you might be out there and maybe the person's not nice to you, but they could be your best friend a year from now, standing next to you. I mean, even Abby Johnson, who was the National Employee of the Year, she wasn't always nice, right? I had friends who were told off proper by Abby Johnson at her clinic, and they did not believe it when they heard that she had become a pro-lifer. They're like, that's not the Abby Johnson this must be some kind of a typo. But God's actually working on these people, and that's why we have to go in there with an attitude of love toward these people.
The pro-life movement is fighting God's battle.
Because what the abortionists want is to see signs of weakness, right? And God is undefeated throughout history. So we're on God's side, so we don't have to worry that the victory is ours, you know, and all we have to do is do our little part. And the other thing I think people worry about is like, well, what about all the logistics, all the things I'm going to have to do? They treat it like a job. And I did the same thing, like, man, before we even got to our first abortion clinic, there's so many things I have to worry about to end abortion. No, it's not my battle, it's God's battle, right? All I got to do is show up. And when you show up, it's laid out for you. So people wonder about what should they do with their life. You know, the average American's watching 5 hours of television on the internet, listening to their MP3. If they give God, like I couldn't even create ridiculous, what I would be worried about is creating a goal I couldn't achieve. Like I would think about abortion, I'd be like, I need to give like 4 hours a day to that. And I would shut myself down. I can't do that. So I just would do nothing. So I started to create an achievable goal. I can give 5 minutes, right? That I can definitely do every day. And so I'd say, well, rather than saying during 40 Days for Life, I'm going to go out there for 2 or 3 hours, knowing I will never do that, right? I'm too busy. I'll go out for 5 or 15, but I would never be there for 5 or 15. I would end up meeting the people. I'd realize like, wow, these people deserve more than 5 minutes of my time. This person needs a half hour, right? And so it's like, I encourage people, if they think that they're too busy, to actually be involved in this spiritual battlefield.
The pro-life movement is a spiritual battle.
The other thing about being on this is a spiritual battlefield in front of a Planned Parenthood or an abortion clinic, that it's the difference between reading about all the rules of basketball, you know, with the Bible or the Quran or whatever book you read, and playing basketball. You can memorize the rules of basketball and still be a terrible basketball player, right? When you go to the basketball court, you learn what dribbling is. You learn that you have to dribble to do anything, right? And it's the same thing when you go to the spiritual battlefield. If you will actually go to the spiritual battlefield, even for a few minutes, all that memorization that you did, all those scripture verses will start to make sense. And I've been surprised by that. Over and over again, I'm like, oh, that's what that scripture verse actually means. I'm actually seeing it in the real world. So if you want to actually grow in your spiritual life, get out to the spiritual battlefield, and all that time spent worshiping God starts to make sense when you start to serve God. And I think I was like a lot of spiritually minded people. I confused the worship of God for 1 hour on Sunday with the service of God. And when you come together to worship after you've been serving God throughout the week, then it's like recovery time. You know, like I was a sponge taking in water but never being released into the world. I was always it was just falling off me. So my life changed dramatically when I actually started for the first time going, and abortion is just a symptom. It's one of many spiritual battlefields, but it actually changed my life spiritually to actually, all that stuff that I'd learned started to make sense. So, you know, come to the spiritual battlefield for the blessings. It's not all bad. You know, some of it's bad, but part of that's even God working on you to make you better and to strengthen you in the fire.